Your role in the new Mass Effect is the Pathfinder, a visionary leader whose hands will shape the character and structure of future civilization in the Andromeda Galaxy. A fresh start for the races of the Milky Way, a chance to build into the new on the structure of the old. The first Mass Effect game was that pathfinding title for BioWare, its first foray into the more cinematic, choreographed role-playing games that it's been making ever since. It was the big leap into a world where role-playing games were more hybridized with real-time action titles, presented in a way that's a lot more Hollywood and a lot less unseen hand of the Dungeon Master. It felt like something truly groundbreaking at the time as well. Mass Effect 1 hit all the rhythms and high points of previous BioWare classics, from the adventuring party to the world building, but with a glossy cinematic presentation and fast-paced, over-the-shoulder shooting mechanics that were novel in a role-playing game at the time. It was a deliberate blend of the older expository style and the new premium cable approach. Over time, the next two Mass Effect games leaned more and more heavily into their visual storytelling and action set-pieces and farther away from the wordier, slower-paced original game. Mass Effect 3 was so far shifted into BioWare's new direction that it did away with planetary side questing and chopped down its conversational approaches from 3 to 2, eliminating the neutral Cavalier option in favor of the stronger Paragon-Renegade dynamic. Mass Effect 3 told a blockbuster action epic, capping off a 100-hour or more trilogy by sacrificing the kind of quiet, player-driven exploration and bright exposition of the first in favor of a bleak vision of a galaxy on fire, a game-long war where Commander Shepard is defined by military command. It's the kind of pulpy, epic space war championed by authors like David Brin decades ago, but more importantly, Mass Effect 3's enormous differences in storytelling, tone, and mechanical prioritization made it feel leagues away from the first. It didn't have that sense of novelty in the game design or the twists that the first game had. People were irritated by its reduced narrative complexity, its more linear and utilitarian world-building, its historically frustrating ending. DLC did a lot to improve and broaden the third game and make it feel more connected to the first, but it never got that feeling back from the first game, that Pathfinder feeling, that blend of curiosity and intensity and investment. Although many of the original Mass Effect's game systems are clunky and are awkward, and the seams holding the game together are more visible today than ever, that feeling is still there when I've replayed it. It's an important transition title, not just for BioWare's catalog, but for RPG development in general. If not for modern BioWare's sole focus on bombastic, action-driven RPGs, would there be such a hungry market for Obsidian's crowd-funded isometric throwbacks? So, for BioWare to return to Mass Effect after the original trilogy's controversial conclusion creates a lot of questions of brand identity and issues of how to tonally move forward. Should Andromeda be more like Mass Effect 3, its immediate predecessor, or Mass Effect 1, which set the tone and defined so much of what makes the game world distinct? In marketing materials, the first thing they really teased about the game was the Nomad, the replacement of the first game's Mako rover. The Mako was a symbol to fans of what was unique about the first game: its clunkiness, its optimism, its tremendous breadth of optional content and exploration, and also its comical cheapness in letting the player actually interact with those explorative elements. They were beginning with a new version of the Mako for Andromeda. Surely that meant that they were looping back to the design priorities of the first game. That was clearly the intention. A new galaxy, a new start for the franchise. When the human arc arrives, though, they are dismayed to find that nothing was as expected, and the planets they thought would be welcoming and exciting were instead wastelands where much work would have to be done to make them habitable. It's a fair warning. The player's greatest struggle is to make themselves feel at home in a wasteland of inhospitable and superfluous game systems. Mass Effect Andromeda as a whole experience couldn't have felt more opposite to the first game. Andromeda feels outdated in a way that I wasn't prepared for. It feels behind the curve of even BioWare's own catalog. Mass Effect 3 focuses on a handful of compact, highly detailed slice-of-life planets, and made them memorable for the short time that you were there. Dragon Age Inquisition had relatively strong regional plots, and gave its sprawling land narrative definition. Mass Effect 2 had tight level design and, for the most part, snappier dialogue than Andromeda, and Mass Effect 1, for all its many technical shortcomings, felt like it was much more effective in layering in exposition and world-building, laying a foundation for the games to follow. Andromeda is a mix of motifs and aspirations that evoke the previous games while failing to go beyond nostalgic imitation. It's not a wholly bad game, but it's the most inconsistent and unfocused of the entire BioWare catalog. I'll put it another way. Mass Effect Andromeda is the Blues Brothers 2000 of electronic role-playing. It exists only because people loved the first one, and fails because all it has to offer is its needy corporate nostalgia. It looks similar, walks the same basic narrative path, but there's a resistance to genuinely embracing creativity and novelty that continually handicaps the game. In a game whose principal theme is the virtue of daring curiosity in the face of the unknown, the design plays it as safe as possible at every juncture. A chance to adventure in a new galaxy is a chance to dial up the exoticism and double down on things that would be difficult for television to portray, putting convincing illustration to something that would look too silly in makeup and rubber. To see creatures that are bizarre and impossible, landscapes whose harshness and strangeness stretch the imagination. Why else go to a new galaxy if it's going to look the same, sound the same? That's Andromeda's central problem. Its whole setup is a mandate towards wonder and creativity. Mass Effect Andromeda shares in the premium cable era approach to science fiction that Mass Effect 2 and 3 have in terms of presentation, but it falls down the ladder to basic cable in terms of imagination. No alien that couldn't be portrayed by humans in makeup. No ideas it takes more than 42 minutes to explore. And rubbery-looking schmucks that cannot emote for actors. There are so many individual components of Mass Effect 1 design that it reincorporates, like planetary exploration, a focus on side content, a more optimistic and curious tone. But the one critical thing it doesn't recycle is a sense of pushing what's been portrayed in a science fiction media before. When Mass Effect 1 came out, the Reapers were a memorably impressive villain for video games, in terms of scale, in terms of menace. Its aliens were often human-like, but the game had a wide variety of strange archetypes, with deep cultures, explored in memorable side conversation. Andromeda has only 2 new alien races, one of which is hostile, with bony faces and an arsenal of assault rifles and shotguns that the player can also use, and the other one, the friendly one, is just a rip-off of James Cameron's Blue Space Cats. Most disappointing about all this is the missed opportunity. Games, more than television by a huge margin, almost as much as books, are able to illustrate impossible things. So, to limit your science fiction to the creative range of an old episode of Stargate SG-1 and a big-budget 2017 game about the thrill of exploration is puzzling. Why would the writers be so unwilling to live up to the lessons of their own characters? The setup is so solid, though. The Andromeda Initiative is a borderless organization in which each of the major species of the Citadel from the first trilogy create an arc to sail the space between galaxies and set up a totally independent civilization. When you arrive, the arcs have been missing and the forward team has spent a year or more in chaos and starvation. Your father is the human pathfinder, but passes the mantle down to you within the first couple hours of the game. The game tries to pull the player into the immediate present tense of the plot by focusing right off on your character's family. Your sibling, whichever gender you didn't choose for your own character, is in a coma after the ship received damage on arrival. Your father, trying to retain command, is an aloof and intimidating figure. You define for yourself in dialogue if your character feels emotionally connected to him or not. And in a clever bit of face math, his character model always looks plausibly related to your character. In my run, he extremely resembled Edward James Olmos, which I really got a kick out of. A central mystery of the game relates to why and how your father became the human pathfinder and why he would pass the honor directly to you in violation of the chain of command. It's a mystery that you solve via collection quest. This disconnect between setup and execution is terminal to a lot of the game's narrative ambition. As Pathfinder, you take the broken pieces of the initiative and reforge them into the original, relentlessly optimistic vision that everyone left their homes behind for. It's a compelling role to play, and the thematic connection to the tone of the first game is strong. There, as the first human Spectre, you shaped how the other races would view humanity. Ambitious and cutthroat, or diplomatic and generous? All eyes were on you to excel at a job that everyone was skeptical of your ability to even perform in the first place. The Pathfinder is looked at the same way, to the same ends. You're a pioneer, a diplomat, and a soldier, in that order. Yet the gameplay experience of being the Pathfinder is disappointingly similar to being the Inquisitor in the last Dragon Age. You're more of a box checker-in-chief than a genuine leader. The flow of the narrative is relentlessly artificial, gating meaningful story developments behind trite and bland collect-and-kill mission objectives. Take the road to placing an outpost on the pirate settlement of Kadara Port. There's a thieves' war between Sloane Kelly, the Pirate Queen, and an unknown aggressor. The quest log tells you that to settle Kadara, you have to be working with a guy named Reyes. But the Reyes quests are mostly just wacky hijinks. Reyes trying desperately to come across as Space Zorro. After several missions that appear to have no significance whatsoever to the larger plot outside of palling around with a clever Latin space pirate, it's revealed that Reyes is the shadowy usurper that's been dogging Kelly all along. So now he's very sinister and not very playful at all. Only after choosing between Kelly and Reyes in a showdown so bursting with B-movie tough guy nonsense it's remarkable you still have room to maneuver your character in combat that you're able to set up the outpost. You are not given an explanation of why you're compelled to do these quests until you see exactly what the game wanted to show you. What you eventually build for the Andromeda Initiative is compelling enough to build the foundation of the plot on, but you have to put up with every boring objective and every commercial break fade-out plot revelation that the game throws in your lap to see it through. Andromeda is most adept with its own nostalgia. It mimics the way Mass Effect opens, giving you two companions in a similar way. It starts you off with Liam, a well-meaning and loyal security officer, just like Kaidan in the first game, just like Jacob in the second, and then you pick up a capable female officer and the rightful second in line for the Pathfinder, Cora. She fills the same tonal and structural position as Ashley and Miranda. In its best moments, Andromeda can take these deliberate echoes of past games and put a distinctive twist on it, making it feel unique to that particular game. It learned a lot of lessons from the wonderful Citadel DLC for Mass Effect 3. That DLC provided many moments of companionable hanging out and domestic scenes for the crew of the Normandy, making their personal and professional connections seem more real and more grounded. Andromeda fleshes out its companion characters from the very beginning in ways that skew more towards Citadel than the stand here and answer my questions on your resume and culture approach of Mass Effect 1. As a result, Liam and Cora seem more consistently human and grounded as the game goes along than their thematic counterparts in the original trilogy. Loyalty quests make a return as well, a popular and likable mechanic from the second and third game, whereby companion dialogue reaches a gameplay climax in a mission centered around that companion's personal struggle. Liam's loyalty quest is an example of the game doing that sort of character writing well. Liam's ambition and impatience with the organization is present from the beginning. His loyalty quest has him planning an adventure under your character's nose, and then having him depend on your main character's friendship and patience to save the adventure that he planned and to pull off the objective. Builds naturally, the banter is quick, and at the end it really is something that would create a deeper bond between the two characters. Cora has a much more utilitarian loyalty mission. Hers is finding the Asari Ark. This is such a critical part of the general plot that to have it classified and structured as a loyalty mission is kind of bizarre. It shortchanges both Cora and the mystery of the missing Ark. Cora has great moments of character building, especially an early scene where she talks about her passion for botany and her hopes in joining the expedition in the first place. But her mechanical power set is biotics, the franchise's psychic space magic. Much of her backstory is dominated by her military self-identity as a human member of an Asari commando unit. The Ark is currently being helmed by her old commanding officer, which makes it a personal quest. Her old CO made some poor, selfish decisions, and Cora has to cope with that, but it doesn't feel as personal as Liam's loyalty quest. The big moral letdown is predictable and simple. The main plot is advanced by what's classified as side content, personal content. It's far from the only time that Andromeda props up rickety, disorganized structure with bland and predictable writing, but the real cruelty is in showing that it can do better from time to time, and then letting the player down anyway. The sparks and fire where the dream of a new start meets the cold reality of the new place is fascinating. It's a skeleton setup that can be fleshed out with millions of creative details. Andromeda, to its deepest detriment, so prioritized nostalgia that it simply repackaged an overwhelming number of plot points and creative directions of previous titles instead of coming up with something genuinely creative on its own. There's no better place to see this than in another one of your companions, Peebee. She's a one-for-one replacement for Liara in the plot, but with her personality inverted. Both are genius Asari archaeologists, young enough to still have to work for respect in their fields, and brave enough to go out and delve the ancient ruins that will give them answers. Liara has the Protheans. Peebee has the Remnant, the ancient machine race whose terraformers you spend the entire game trying to turn on. Liara is demure and professionally minded. Peebee is flirtatious and revels in change and conflict. She's actually got a lot of good jokes, and her more mercurial personality makes her a more active participant in banter and the squad ensemble than Liara was, but her position as being functionally equal in personality opposite to the original trilogy's most prominent Asari is awkward and obvious, which is why it came as such a surprise that her loyalty quest was one of the best moments in the entire game. Her conversation progression reveals more and more about a catty rivalry she has with an ex-girlfriend. Her ex is an absolutely cartoonish foil, showing up at the most obviously nefarious moments, throwing out lame insults and talking down to PB like a character from Heathers. It all builds in a direction where PB is going to have some kind of life-or-death confrontation with her rival, which sounds like overdramatic nonsense of questionable quality, which it absolutely is, but it takes place in a unique and purposefully hidden remnant facility on a decaying volcanic planet. It's one of the most dramatic environments in Andromeda, and its sense of danger and mystery is strong. The mission design itself, from environmental art and detail to the pacing of the action, is as well produced and engaging as any of the better sequences of Mass Effect 3. But it's a fluke. The grand majority of content and questing is done in a style much closer to Dragon Age Inquisition than to Mass Effect 3. The ending of most quests is a green checkmark indicating that you are, in fact, a good boy who deserves a treat. Even in PB's final, long-predicted confrontation, everything plays out exactly as you might expect. The fate of an important artifact, in balance with her ex's life. Let PB save her old friend and lover and lose the fruit of their archaeological search, or take the choice away from PB and make sure that her rival dies so that the artifact can be recovered. The choice given is not a complex one. And more disappointingly, the Remnant never develop an opposite personality from their trilogy counterpart like was done with Liara and PB. The Remnant fill exactly the same role of mysterious, technologically advanced monolithic culture for exactly the same reasons that the Prothean did. To create a trail of vague breadcrumbs for the player to follow, and provide a point of contest between the player and their nemesis. The first Mass Effect had Saren. Andromeda tries to follow in those footsteps, but comes up achingly short. Having Saren be your game-long nemesis in the first Mass Effect was narratively powerful. He was a Spectre like you. He took the same risks you took. His path is one that the player seems like they could end up on if the player isn't being morally careful. In the end, you are great nemeses because you're peers and equals, starting from a similar foundation and diverging profoundly in choice and beliefs. The Archon of the Ket, your nemesis in Andromeda, is cold and remote in a way that's much more boring than menacing. He thinks he's right because he's genetically the best. He has no crisis of fate or conscience to loop the player into. The Archon is a bad guy because he's, well, a bad guy, just not very nice altogether, however you look at the situation. He wants to use the terraforming network as a weapon. What can create life can destroy life, etc., etc. There are birthday cards, more narratively surprising and satisfying than the Ket and the Archon. Following the first game in terms of climax is especially difficult on account of this. The first game had a personal villain, a miles-long, impersonal villain, and the threat of invasion from more giant angry cyber squids. All of these threats layered on top of one another, popping off in a rapid succession of deeply satisfying resolutions. Your nemesis you fight personally, twice, or once if you talk him into killing himself before the Reaperized version of him gets back up again. The second boss, the Reaper Sovereign, is taken down by a coalition of the allies you've made, either a mix of humans and aliens who band together to share the risk and loss, or a triumphant human fleet moving in for the kill after the Citadel races are floating dead in the vacuum of space. And then you're given thanks, recognition, and the dire warning that Sovereign was simply the first of many like it. So all the activity addressed by the game is mostly resolved. There's really no actionable threat left at the end of the game. But there is the mystery and danger of the long-absent Reaper still hanging in the air, keeping you invested, waiting for what comes next, satisfied, but excited. The Archon and Ket can't shoulder this narrative burden. The Ket are the most boring aliens in the entire franchise. There is so little to say about them, so few themes actually being explored, and much of that is just a repeat of stuff already done with Reapers and the Collectors in the second game. You encounter the Ket when you first make planetfall on Habitat 7, before the mantle of Pathfinders even passed down. Your character has, at that time, the option of lamenting that first contact was violent. So much lost, how disappointing, that what was solved with guns in the Milky Way would have to be solved with guns here as well. But Mass Effect Andromeda is an action game, and the Ket must be there for you to perform action upon. It wouldn't have even been necessarily a creative misstep if not for how truly generic they are as villainous space dudes. I'm dead serious when I say that Ceres and the reptile villains from Galaxy Quest would be an even swap, and you wouldn't even have to change the ship design much. All you need to know is that they're mean, and their ships and equipment are predominantly green. In this way, the mechanical demands of the nostalgic structure cheapened the writing. The original Mass Effect trilogy is about, experientially, a lot of shooting. So, a villain must exist for you to shoot at and to shoot at you. They have to fit a template of attacks that must have equivalents in the Outlaw family of things to shoot, and the Remnant family of things to shoot, for multiplayer consistency. They must use weapons that fall neatly into categories of gun that the player can use as well. They must not exceed the player's ability to defeat them in combat or in the plot. There were many things that the Ket had to functionally be before a personality and a culture could even be developed for them. They were doomed, by format, to be something familiar. So you've got a race of religious zealots who steal genetic material from the races they conquer. They turn us into them! But there was already so much of what was done in Mass Effect. The big reveal that the Collectors were the Protheans in Mass Effect 2, the reprised versions of all the familiar races at the Citadel in Mass Effect 3. Hell, even the scene of the colonists being put on spikes that changed them into husks in the first 15 minutes of Mass Effect 1. It's not just that it's simple. It's that it's simple and has already been done time and time again within the Mass Effect franchise already. Andromeda is a fresh start. To be this stale and uncreative is a choice that was deliberately made. The Ket's religious structure is interesting, sure, but little detail is put into it. It's just a set of related words to use for enemy titles. This one's anointed, he's big and tough, we'll give him a big gun. This one's ascendant, we'll give him a floating orb shield thingamajig. You can go into the Codex and look up some encyclopedia entries about the individual types of Ket enemies, but I never found them to function as anything more dynamic than cannon fodder, dispensed by the computer to provide the player something to do besides ask questions. In fact, much of the late-game world-building done with the Ket makes them even more boring, revealing that there is political disagreement among the Ket that the Archon is foolish in his pursuit of remnant technology just paints the Ket as unimaginatively villainous. A wider body of ornery bad space dudes who strongly object to tactical creativity on the part of the executive ornery bad space dudes. To have made them uniformly zealous and to have made their religion so central to their culture is a pretty bold creative choice. It makes them more alien. But giving them a fearful bureaucracy makes them more human. A banal and straightforward race of jerks. It's not the only major theme borrowed from the trilogy to be explored in less detail. Besides, explorations of artificial intelligence also feature prominently in Andromeda. Instead of EDI, you have Sam, a human-built artificial intelligence that's directly wired into the brains of the Ryder family, that sees through their eyes and grows as they learn. It's an interesting setup, but the execution is as flat and utilitarian as it comes. Sam is just a way to narratively justify hiding the memories of the Elder Rider, the original Pathfinder, behind a multi-planet collection quest. Sam is a voice that tells you all the obvious things you're supposed to be doing in the game world in case you're new to games, or maybe young, or maybe stoned. Though the game makes a point of how Papa Ryder was excommunicated from the Alliance for his AI research, hardly anyone in Andromeda objects to the presence of an AI. It's handy. Let it stay. The Quarian arc, housing a culture who might object to this kind of thing, is never found within the course of the main game. They just don't show up. You even recover at the end of a quest that seems at first glance to be completely tangential and not at all noteworthy, an ancient artificial intelligence who wishes to die. You can let it, of course, or you can give it over to Sam to keep company. But nothing is fundamentally revealed about who built the ancient computer, what it's capable of, what history it might hold. Just a little dilemma where it asks to die, and you get to decide to grant or deny that request. Andromeda, again, comes up with a great setup, and then kind of brushes off its hands and calls it a day. It's a game that values convenience over science fiction coherency. In the new Mass Effect, more than the original trilogy even, there is little distinction between its science and the magic of a world like one in Dragon Age. As the game opens, Habitat 7, along with the other places you'll attempt to colonize in the game, have decayed from the golden worlds they were supposed to be into barely habitable wastelands. Tendrils of what they call dark energy have choked the region of space, laying waste to ecosystems and atmospheres of planets touched by them. In science, dark matter and energy is matter and energy which, by mass, ought to be there, but isn't. It's matter and activity indetectable to us as human creatures with the tools we know, but predicted in the equations that we write. In the game, dark obviously means bad, or maybe mean-tempered, so what we're going to do here is have an angry space algae and then say, oh, that's some dark matter right there, and then hope everyone just sort of nods along with it. The original trilogy always stayed closer to pop sci-fi than hard sci-fi, which is sci-fi principally grounded in actual science. They always had a lot of devices and conceits which were fantastical, like biotics standing in for magical spells, but when you play and compare Mass Effect Andromeda and Dragon Age Inquisition, the kind of approach taken to magic and technology is interchangeable in a way that feels deeply, hopelessly cheap and half-assed. There are plenty of sci-fi authors and sci-fi movies that play fast and loose with believability, but the combination of predictable and tired ideas with an anything goes, it doesn't need explanation if you call it advanced approach to science fiction world building only deepens the basic cable sci-fi feel that haunts the entire experience of Andromeda. Similarly, the whole expedition is a little confusing within the technology of the setting. One of the big plot points of the original games is that the Mass Effect relays have shaped interstellar travel, that traveling long distances without the relays is kind of an unknown science for the most part. So Andromeda opens, and characters don't comment much beyond 600 years to breach the harsh and infinitely dark void between galaxies, and boy are my arms tired. Wasn't it also a major plot point how the Reapers are some of the only technological constructs who can survive in the intergalactic void? Isn't 600 years a little unreasonably short, even by the franchise's own fiction, for such a journey? You can make the argument that the focus on banter and character over the nitty-gritty of made-up hows and whys is a deliberate and progressive presentational choice, but half the fun of sci-fi is seeing people come up with coherent and challenging what-ifs for future technology and ways of life. Confident, definitive answers to nerdy questions of the sci-fi details would give the characters an extra crutch to stand on in moments where they need to be taken more seriously by the plot. As it stands, it's difficult to feel serious tension when you know that the script is unafraid of using even the most blatant and obvious deus ex machina and then hand-waving the in-world credibility of it. The cheapest feeling of all the game's creative decisions is the way they wrote in the other new alien race, the fish-cat-mer people of the Angara. The Angara fit in much too effortlessly with the Milky Way races. They are just culturally and biologically distinct enough not to infringe on the identity of the Citadel species, but also not different enough that they don't already fit into some kind of pre-existent Earth cliché anyway. They're a stock, standard, anciently standard, noble savage archetype, and they feel so narratively dated that it is crazy. It's frustrating because I feel like the first game would have had the guts to tackle the kind of narrative needed to negotiate a story where you are essentially reliving colonialism in a campy sci-fi context. This is the Angara's part of the galaxy. They've already named and explored most of everywhere that you visit in the game. But most of them died before you got there, at the hands of the cat and the mysterious magical space algae. So you get to go in, rename their shit, build over it, and then expect them to be delighted and impressed with your cleverness in moving into and bulldozing over the homes of their ancestors. I mean, it really does not get much more explicitly colonial than that, and your character can certainly pay lip service to the broader context of all this, but at no point is it seriously suggested that the initiative is any less impressive for moving into a foreclosed-on part of a popular galaxy than it would be for actually conquering a blank frontier. The level of seriousness and skill with which these themes are tackled by the game is roughly on par with Cool Runnings anyway. The willingness of the first game to portray aliens as being skeptical of and biased against humans was some of what made it truly interesting. Proving the Citadel Council wrong through your heroism and fidelity to compassionate values is what makes the Paragon path so rewarding an underdog story. Proving their mistrust correct by letting them all die to pursue an Earth-first agenda is what made the Renegade ending so startling and memorable in the first game. To put such a thematic powder keg in the middle of Andromeda's script, but to never really detonate it, is quite the cop-out. But the Angaran's worst feature by far is being a boring cliché. The Angara, a completely new race from a new galaxy, has instantly identifiable traits and features. They have gendered and gendered behavior. They have bureaucracy. They have the Ket resistance movement. They use hand weapons, like assault rifles and shotguns and pistols. They flirt with you. You can flirt back. There is little about them that's really very alien at all. Their sacred city of Aya, once you get used to its layout, isn't much more than a very well-landscaped mall. Out of all of Andromeda's narrative choices, the one to make the Angara so relentlessly derivative and plain stands as the most petty refusal to be creative in the entire game. The closest you get to actually engaging with the politics of colonization is with the loyalty quest for Jal, your Angaran companion. There's a faction of the Angara who hate all aliens, no matter how well-intentioned or fancily dressed. This faction, the Rokar, has persuaded Jal's family to join its cause. Jal takes the Pathfinder along with him to show that humans aren't so bad after all. The dialogue is about as natural as a vat-grown hamburger. There are episodes of Babylon 5 that handle family and loyalty better. There are episodes of Babylon 5 that seem to have higher production values as well. While the fundamental message is all right, judge people as individuals, show compassion, etc., the delivery is so melodramatically spoken, ham-fistedly written, and poorly animated that it feels like something played off of VHS tape by a substitute teacher in some dusty classroom, a handwritten label on the cassette reading, Mass Effect and Friends, Volume 2. Jal, as a companion character and crew member, is actually mostly well done. The Angara are culturally defined by being open with their feelings, and so Jal has strong opinions on most subjects. His process of coming to understand Milky Way culture leads to some good jokes and some endearing moments, but when you take his doe-eyed stoicism and then expect it to support questions about the moral dimensions of the whole Andromeda initiative, it's obvious that Jal is too simple and too cartoonish a character to bear the narrative weight. And his manner with the crew, even down to the accent, is a nostalgic dead ringer for Javik, Mass Effect 3's Prothean companion. Not everyone got to adventure with Javik because he was broken off into DLC, so not all returning players will see the parallel, but the parallel is more obvious, intentional, and ham-fisted than even the PB Liara conceptual relationship. On a moment-to-moment basis, Jal is a likable enough character, but he is derivative and shallow once you get down to it. Drac, your Krogan companion, is the same way. His banter is strong, and his place in the greater ensemble as the cranky old war veteran is well defined, but his loyalty quest is a complete eye-roller. Again, the setup is good. A ship full of Krogan seeds needed to feed the new Krogan colony was stolen. You have to fight to get it back, but Drac has a soft and geeky grandson who's trapped on the ship. A soft and geeky Krogan, who, over the course of the mission, Drac learns to love and accept. It's pretty much a miniature sci-fi version of the dynamic between the greasy hacker kid and Bruce Willis in Live Free or Die Hard, while somehow managing to be even more irritating. Drac is a good concept, with an incredibly low-effort narrative follow-through. And yet, despite individual character weakness and shallow writing, the whole ensemble functions well and comes across memorably. More than who they are individually and their articulations of their personality is how the companions all argue and grow close over time, how the adventure changes them and lets them grow into greater versions of themselves. The emotional investment this creates, learning about them and sharing experiences you come to master your own role and place in the new galaxy, having their experience appear to run in perfect parallel to yours, is tremendous. When you're off the ship, so are they, drinking and yelling and studying and otherwise pursuing totally independent lives. They even have a ton of different optional conversations that play out in the broader game world. You can get into a bar fight in a pirate port with Drac. You can go rock climbing at the sulfur springs in an alien desert with Vetra. You can rent movies for Liam and the crew at the Nexus space station. The scenes of domesticity and friendly banter that made Mass Effect 3 Citadel DLC so memorable and necessary have saved how much of the character building is accomplished here. It's great, genuinely. I felt the most invested in the game and its world during these moments. I wanted the moments of wonder and exploration to be my favorites in the game. I wanted that pioneering spirit to dominate, but instead it's these interpersonal moments that best define Andromeda. Moments handled with the bombast and personality of the third game, coupled with the idealistic and plucky rhythmic arc of the first. It's a winning combination when it finally presents itself, and the best example of franchise nostalgia providing a foundation for new creativity in the title, and not simply ensuring that creative risk doesn't take place at all. Yet, even when playing it safe and staying a court-ordered distance away from true novelty, the game hobbles its own presentation with its powerfully underwhelming animations. Normally, I wouldn't complain about something like lip-syncing and facial animation. I grew up during the static mouth-wobble era of game design, and I've been easily impressed ever since. But Mass Effect Andromeda has a genuinely serious problem with making its characters not look like pleather puppets most of the time, in a way that Dragon Age Inquisition and the other Mass Effects, except maybe the first, did not. Facial expressions are often either flat or mistimed. Emotional expressiveness on the part of the voice actors does not make it all the way onto the faces of the characters. Mass Effect Andromeda really does have an overwhelming amount of spoken dialogue, and the voice actors do a high-quality job of performing it, but the dead-eyed mannequin look of so many of the side characters undercuts the effort badly. I know Andromeda would have landed better for me if there had been tighter, better choreographed expressions on the faces of the NPCs, or the PC's face for that matter. It's been pointed out that this is a labor concession. Many of these conversations were animated algorithmically by the software, not hand-animated by the team. It's easy to be understanding towards the developers for just how impossibly huge a task it would be to hand-animate the hours and hours and hours of exposition and explanations. It's easy to be sympathetic for the need to use automated resources in completing these conversations. But it is just as easy to point out that the computer doing the algorithm clearly has no idea what's actually being said from one character to another, and it shows. Which is a disservice to the writers and the voice actors. Even when the game finally does get around to a bit of sharp dialogue or a complex bit of science fiction world building, the visual delivery can tank the impact in a moment. A major patch, released about halfway through my playthrough, added a layer of gloss and deeper color to character eyeballs, which made a dent in the utter artificiality of it, but not enough to overcome the feeling that you're just talking to puppets. This gets a little awkward when they won't stop hitting on you. The BioWare romance, where you trade compliments with a character until they tell you they love you right before the final boss fight, has grown from side content to back-of-the-box feature. A lot of pre-release marketing for Andromeda was dedicated to answering the "okay, but which aliens are the horny ones?" questions. And this too plays to the game's preference to marketability over creativity. The Angara could have been anything, but there was a lot of pressure for them to be something with great butts. It's harder to have a "Player 1, I love you so much" scene when your reply as Player 1 would be, "I love you too, faceless, granulated, 9-foot-tall mineral monster from Glorbox 7. Harder still to put that on promotional material, but what would have been lost if they had? The dialogue is campier than usual in Andromeda, the flirtations more often than usual, and even this would have been a fine tonal choice to simply have a more flirtatious Mass Effect if it wasn't for the fact that the folks doing the flirting closer resembled Disneyland animatronics than people. Dragon Age Inquisition was a high watermark for how the studio handles romance. The writing was crisp, the rhythm seemed natural, the characters were very charismatic. Andromeda swings wide. You can be Space Lothario to a degree that borders on self-parody. In fact, when you meet the Angara, right after being given formal permission to interact with the city's inhabitants, you can answer the question of why humanity would cross the gulf of one galaxy to another with a wink and a "to meet people like you, cutie McFish cat." Having romance and sex in the plot can add a meaningful human dimension to the writing. In its better moments, the game is better off, aiming for a broader range of emotional expression with these inclusions, but at its lesser moments, which is most of the time, the romantic stuff is as predictable and campy as Shatner schmoozing up to the girl with the brightest body paint. BioWare has made a surprisingly big deal out of romantic subplots in the game, but the result is deeply inconsistent. Positively, Vetra, your Turian mercenary companion character, is a prime example of the benefit of weaving romance into the script so deeply. Both of her primary romantic scenes are really well done. The first one has her taking Ryder out on a hike to the sulfur springs of an alien desert. There's friendly athletic competition, and then there's a lot of flirting. It has a natural rhythm to it, something personal, something outside the ship, something private. The second scene is even better. Vetra goes to great lengths to find Shepard a real Earth steak to make a real Earth meal, only to yield a comically inedible result. It functions in its standard intended romantic comedy way, a quiet and hokey domestic joke with a sci-fi frame. It's scenes like these, Citadel-influenced scenes, that add a grounded humanity to the characters, even bony alien ladies like Vetra. Yet these scenes are half of what's included. The rest are snippets of dialogue from a world where humanity's proudly planted flags of exploration read, "Call me, XOXO." The one area where nostalgic vision for Andromeda could yield spectacular fruit is in the explorative design. Even if the plot was unimaginative, a genuinely alien vista goes a long way toward redeeming a piece of sci-fi media. They could have shown us anything. They could have given us the high-fidelity versions of the strange and dangerous side planets who bounced the Mako across in the first game. Instead, you've got 6 principal planets. A desert, a really hot desert, a toxic desert, a frozen ice desert, and a blank rocky asteroid. Oh, and the one time they do get really crazy, an overgrown alien jungle covering an artificial city beneath. Plus the introductory planet with its lightning and floating rocks. Everything else you visit is either a ship or a space station or a small urban quest hub. The lone exception being some companion loyalty quests who occasionally get the privilege of having unique locations. Most of the main planets are very large, many square miles of alien landscape, but they're filled with, for lack of a more precise term, MMO content. Objective markers to sweep up that involve either combat or hitting the interact button between 1 and 5 times. They're no worse than the simplistic and short missions you do in the Mako side content of Mass Effect 1, but it has been many years and a pile of money to come up with something better, and it simply isn't any deeper than those recolored rocks of yesteryear. Many of the pacing problems from Inquisition's open-world design linger, including mixing up busy work quests and important and meaningful side content, in an effort to get the player to do all of it. Some quests of little importance, like scan for an underground river in 3 locations, can lead to an optional world boss of enormous size and difficulty. Others simply end with a ubiquitous green checkmark. You've got to put up with a lot of simplistic and boring questing, the kind of filler that drug down Inquisition to unlock the really good stuff. Suddenly, something boring turns into something that feels worth your time, and vice versa. Plus, your nomad buggy moves so quickly that you don't get a sense of the scale of landscape like you do with Inquisition. The planetary maps are at once too large, filled with immemorable nothings and a peppering of good science fiction, and too small, traversed in minutes without appreciating individual regions like an on-foot adventure might. Unfortunately, this inconsistency of engagement does a real number on the sense of unbound exploration Andromeda's trying to create. Welcome to a whole new galaxy of collection objectives. Get ready to shoot and hold down the use key. The open-world portions of the game don't even use the space well. On top of all the various tasks, most of it checklisting, there are entrenched enemy positions scattered all over. You can get out and tackle them, but all you ever get is random loot, and the next time you come through, they'll have respawned. The game's central thematic pillar, the taming of a frontier and the momentum of civilized progress, is constantly eroded by the game map's unwillingness to change and the evaporative impact of all of your activity. Activating each world's ancient terraforming vault does change the world visually and mechanically. It lowers the ambient danger, like heat and radiation. It also changes the time of day or quality of light. It matters, a bit, but little else you do seems to. Aside from a few big-ticket choices that branch the plot in opposite and irreversible ways, the game has deliberately tossed out the Paragon and Renegade system for categorizing choice, and replaced it with a system closer to Dragon Age, where it's all about characterization and motivation. For Mass Effect, it's a weaker system. The choice between Paragon and Renegade was, by the trilogy's end, pretty much reductively binary. But there was always a strong tonal difference between the two options, and significant plot differences between the two play styles. The developers of Andromeda spoke of how the color-coded top-or-bottom choices in the original trilogy made it so that most players would choose one conversational track and ride it out all the way through their whole 120 hours, which is a fair criticism of the system. So they replaced it with a system more based in tone and emotional motivation of the player's response. They wanted to make it so that the player would choose a wider variety of options, to play Ryder in a way that was more personal to them than they might have played Shepard. That's a noble goal, but the reality of it is that the system has defanged what made Mass Effect's conversational choices, binary as they were, so distinctive. It swapped out action in preference to affectation. There are only a few instances, in the quieter moments of loyalty quests, where how you respond really does define the tone of what sort of friendship you strike up with a companion, where the system feels like a more robust one than Paragon Renegade. Regularly, though, what it does is functionally reduce Ryder from 2 extremely divergent characters like Shepard to one character whose temperament changes slightly from player to player. And the choices where the game does genuinely branch, like choosing to leave a squad of Krogan scouts loyal to your companion Drac to die, or the Solarian Pathfinder to die in the same position, the writers seem to deliberately avoid creating an obvious Renegade or Paragon solution, solutions that are either dangerously altruistic or tactically selfish. Each choice involves loss and complicity in the loss in Andromeda. What I'd rather have seen was a mix of the two. A binary of carefully weighted sacrifices feels just as artificial as a constant binary of ethical values with no real variation. Feeling the missions building to these choices, telegraphing them way ahead of time, and knowing that the choice will always be slightly unsatisfactory is as much of an artificiality as knowing ahead of time that you'll have to make a red or blue ethics choice. And because the dialogue choices given to Ryder have so much less functional difference than in the old system, there is a much reduced sense of player ownership over Ryder. Choosing to be kind or cruel is simply more workably dramatic than choosing between professional or goofy, or between emotional and distant. Those choices can work wonderfully, especially in isometric role-playing games where you'd be given 4 or more tonal variations for response. But when you're mostly just given 2 options that steer the conversation along the same general arc, I'd much rather have 2 less realistic but more dramatically branching choices. I didn't feel like there was much value in playing through Andromeda again right away, like I always felt like in the previous games. There's little to look back on and wonder what might have been different. You're pretty much limited to looking back and wistfully wondering if you could have gotten away with being ruder to director Tan. It highlights the gambles and frustrations of game design on a scale like this. They wanted to add emotional complexity, and instead eroded player identity. It must be difficult to not know how these things will pan out once a game is in the wild. Like many things about Andromeda, I appreciate the intent, but I find the execution amazingly counterproductive. The most immediately and noticeably counterproductive series of design choices, however, are absolutely in the inventory and crafting system. The Mass Effect series has gone through several distinctly different ones, starting with a complex but homogeneous scaled system in 1, linear shooter's arsenal and simplified armor system in 2, and then an honestly pretty good mix of unique-feeling weapons with wide variety in the 3rd game. Andromeda goes back to the complexity and unmanageable nonsense of the first game's inventory, while piling on the multiplayer-ready heaps of unique weapons of the 3rd. So there are 3 branches of technology in Andromeda: Milky Way, Helios Cluster, and Remnant. Each has over a dozen weapons to research, suits of armor that require the shoulders, legs, chest pieces, and helmets to be researched separately. Each of the 3 branches has its own category of research points. Each thing you research has up to 10 levels of damage and efficiency, each costlier than the last. You usually get between 20 to 100 points of research for things you scan out in the game world. A single upgrade costs between 80 and 280 points. To research a good level of an armor takes 1,000 or more points, in a single category of points among many. So you have a choice. Have a scant few good weapons, or try out a number of weak low-level versions. That's if you can afford to produce them after researching them. Each gun or armor piece also requires hundreds of units of crafting resource points found on the ground by scouring for anomalies on the star map or by resource scanning a la Mass Effect 2, which you now do in the Nomad by driving around. To actually get the hang of any of this takes the majority of the game, at which point you need to level whatever blueprint you have pretty high up to be consistent with the enemy strength being directed at you. Some bonuses you get from a whole new category of upgrade points called viability points, which give you research points and crafting units at regular intervals. You can get credits in single player for missions performed in multiplayer. It's not an impossible system to use, but it is totally dispiriting to get started with and aggravating the whole way through. At least in the first Mass Effect, it was ultimately simple. The gun with the highest numbers is the one you should keep. In Andromeda, the gun is rarely described before you invest a ton of research and crafting points in it. You might end up with an assault rifle with good stats that you did not realize would be semi-automatic instead of fully automatic. You might get a shotgun that shoots a projectile you didn't want it to shoot. You might end up with a pile of numbers that took you hours to get on a gun that you intensely dislike. At least in Mass Effect 3, you could experiment without much consequence. If you didn't like a gun, you could just buy a new one, which is an option here too, but the best guns are crafted, the best armor is crafted, and the crafting itself is an infuriating mess. Andromeda went back to the first game, which people praised for its complexity versus the sequels, so Andromeda made its own inventory needlessly complex, completely ignoring the workable system they already had with Mass Effect 3. They're already doing so much of the layered single-player, multiplayer content the same as they did in Mass Effect 3. They don't need to shove in arrays of superfluous systems while eroding the systems that they do have and rely on. But that's the Andromeda way. Nostalgia at any cost. The viability point system even has its own post-game climax if you raise every major planet to the 100% viable mark. You're given a call of congratulations and asked to return as soon as convenient to Habitat 7, the shattered world of electrical storms and disrupted gravity, where your role as the Pathfinder began. There you see the world as a glowing yellow orb, surrounded by a force field, while the planet is being terraformed underneath, without the help of the remnant terraformer, which is broken. The initiative itself will reclaim the world on the behalf of the Milky Way civilizations. They're naming the planet after your family, the Riders. There's your reward for total submission to the game's busy work. A planet you don't get to see turned into a monument towards the ego of the character that you play. The reality of gameplay is that to achieve 100% viability, you're just ticking boxes. You don't even have to do every single quest to achieve it on some planets like Eos, which is a nice concession on the game's part. But the things you do to make the planets more viable are arbitrary. Find a spot to deploy a pod, have 2%. Help out a random settler with a personal problem, have 5%. Defeat an ancient gigantic robot worm monster, have 10%. There is little correspondence between the viability rating, which inconsistently measures how many quests and activities you've done, and any kind of actual world building around humanity and the other Milky Way races getting a foothold in the new environments. The little cutscene through which the game congratulates you is an almost insulting ice on the cake. Thanks to your long hours completing varied and mostly frivolous tasks, we're going to claim to terraform the world with the magical floating rocks, but not bother to devote any art resources to showing you how they're keeping the boulders on the ground. Similarly, the payoff for following the Ryder family secret plotline is so much less than it could have been. The main revelation relates to the main plot, and it is no revelation at all except to franchise newcomers. The long-hidden secret is that the Andromeda Initiative was funded so well because business interests in the Milky Way knew that the Reapers were coming, and knew some sort of contingency plan was called for. The Elder Rider received transmissions from the galaxy covering some important engagements of Mass Effect 3, and he's left with the impression that everyone home is dead. It's not the only direct reference to the events of the previous Mass Effects. You can find minor characters whose lives are tied to some unexpected previous threads, like a couple Krogan scientists bent on continuing the work of Dr. O'Keir, a villainous Krogan scientist from Mass Effect 2, alongside a violent anti-AI activist whose son was a candidate for the Overlord program that the DLC of the same name is centered around. The direct references are mostly tangential, or, in the case of the Reaper invasion, secretive. But hardly any direct references are needed on account of how much simply reappears in some kind of slightly shook-up doppelganger form from the original trilogy. Most frustrating of all with Andromeda is not what was left out from the original trilogy, but what feels like was omitted from Andromeda itself. I'm tired of having to wait a year for the fullest, most meaningful experience of a BioWare RPG. Mass Effect 3 and Dragon Age Inquisition were both flat and incomplete on release compared to how they were with all the DLC included. Mass Effect 3 particularly relegated an important crew member, unbelievably important lore regarding the origin of the Reapers, and its best character interaction to DLC that most people never touched. Inquisition resolved dozens of its dangling plot points in the genuinely incredible Trespasser DLC. On release, these games have felt like they lacked something critical, and then, bit by bit, you spend another $30 to $60 on extra content and supplementary adventures that give the game the definition that it was lacking at first release. Generally speaking, I am a DLC junkie. I can't get enough of the little extras and bonus content that developers release, but the many dangling threads of the plot and the straightforward, weak way the main campaign ends in Andromeda have got me especially judgmental about the game for it this time. It's not so much that there was just a little foreshadowing done of the main campaign for the DLCs, it's that there are huge chunks of what ought to be there for a complete and satisfying story, simply missing a sold separately label in the place of a branch on the dialogue tree. What of the other arcs, the Quarians, the Hanar? What were the Remnant? Do the Ket care about anything besides making more Ket? What will become of the Ryder family now? All of these questions ought to have received some kind of attention, but they're not so centrally important to the plot that Andromeda can't carry on without them being answered. Yet they obviously will be answered. Eventually. For $10 a pop. The end of Andromeda is much more like the end of Mass Effect 2. There's the big mission to the distant, mysterious space station, but after that, you're encouraged to keep going and mop up the rest of the side content. Wait around a while for the DLC to finish up. Like everything else with Andromeda's quest structure, the ending feels infuriatingly soft. Just one more piece of content in the content constellation, not the definitive climax of a 60-hour experience. Sure, you fight the Archon, but not personally. It's wave defense as you shut down his control over the space station systems. Hit the button, fight, wait, hit another button, fight, wait, hit the final button, ka-ching, save the galaxy, sport, good job. And there's an after-credits teaser scene of a very mad Ket warlord storming off. Like Mass Effect 1, your adventures are just beginning, right? Except the Reapers were an intriguing threat and an enduring series mystery. In the next game, you fight more boneheaded jerks is not a big enough revelation to keep me on the hook. I've barely talked at all about the Remnant, the lost civilization replacing the Protheans from the main trilogy. So little is revealed about them that it's obvious that they're saving that for future Andromeda titles as well. They're mostly just a class of enemy in a category of game architecture. The Protheans were a better developed mystery, lost to time, holders of the hidden knowledge. The Remnant are simply makers of the great global air conditioners. Not enough was done to create intrigue or mystery. Andromeda seems to feel that action and architecture flatly equate to intrigue. You are in a strange place, you did a cool-looking thing, you probably wouldn't have done the thing if you weren't interested. That's it. I didn't connect to the grand arc of the game's plot at all. I spent the majority of the game crossing my fingers that they would throw in some concrete lore and world-building details that would really hook me, and then the game ended. Don't worry, my quest log assured me. You can still go back and collect 10 sonic toothbrushes on Eladine while you wait for the next exciting installment. Andromeda was a game I was looking forward to from the moment I heard about it. A new chance for the franchise, its aesthetic, its ideas, minus Shepard and the Reapers and the incredible cost of continuing to branch the original trilogy's choices. But the actual game is so much less than it could have been. Creatively less, in a way that's more about Andromeda being purposefully simplistic with its ideas than it is about the game not having received enough investment. It's obvious that the game is already full to bursting with investments of time, work, money. It is a gigantic, sprawling, high-definition epic. But it is a gigantic epic that I kind of wish I had not spent so much time on. At the end of Dragon Age Inquisition, I was optimistically frustrated. This is a transitional work, I figured. It'll be smooth sailing from here. Andromeda is a much staler and more creatively confused game than Inquisition was. It is not sure what it wants to be, and so grasps wildly at game design straws to try to broaden its appeal. Simplify the plot, complicate the inventory, make the aliens hornier. The original Mass Effect was a pathfinding title because it was quite focused. It knew exactly the kind of bridge it was meant to be between the old BioWare and the new. But now new BioWare has become stuck in its own creative rut, unwilling to take the kind of risks that once made its role-playing games so thoroughly lovable. I do love the Mass Effect trilogy for all its flaws, but I didn't love this. I didn't even like it solidly half the time. I tried to balance my feeling against the knowledge that no one deliberately sets out to make a bad game, that each flopping game mechanic or eye-roll-inducing snippet of dialogue had some kind of nobler intention to start with. But there's so much of it. Thousands of lines of dialogue I didn't connect with. Dozens and dozens of quests I fought off boredom to complete. 100 square miles of game world I found as flat and artificial as a strip of grass on a highway median. The feeling of the first game, that Pathfinder feeling, is still accessible in the first game because of its creativity, its risks, its gambles, its confidence in its storytelling, confidence in the player's imagination to fill in the blanks and be borne along into the world the game is creating. Andromeda has no confidence. Each new mechanic, each plot development is held up before the player like a piece of macaroni art that the player might be persuaded to pin on the refrigerator. There is a cloying need to be liked pervading the game. It takes few gambles. It yields little reward. For all its professed love of adventure and the unknown, Mass Effect Andromeda is the most risk-adverse science fiction story I've ever seen. And that makes for a bad Mass Effect title. Thanks for watching. This video and all the other videos I do are made possible through the crowdfunding website and Patreon. I'd like to thank by name the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to make these videos possible. People like Comfy Hat, Tom, Cassie, Ron Gervais, Gabriel Nichols, Christian Zacharianson, Marcus Persson, Eddie Burton, Soeb Sheik, Nick Cole-Hamilton, Eli Bergmass, Will Hooten, Jake Mays, Dennis Clark, Jake Brennan, Dalton Seiler, World War II Freak, Casey Pioli, Clayton, Julius Dean, Alexander Leister, Brian Hill, Igor Babiuk, Justin Hughes, Kumaran Vijian, Michael Benson, Nobody, Thunder O'Brien, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, Austin Green, Sorcerer Dave, Mike Downing, Tim Dorney, Daniel Barsh, Andrew Tapp, Lassilis, Rhinock, Liang Zhao, Medal of Connor, Jesse Wilkinson, Michael Medalkowski, Lori Ramey, Simon Nearfalk, Peter Rodersky, Argus Swift, Chris Slight, Andre Breregier, Matthew Sutton, Ryan Van Dyke, Antonio Joseph Doval III, Robert Glover, Thomas Whitty, Stephen Francisco Santana, Diller, Sebastian Pironi, Tom Vickers, Will Edwards, Cheryl De Vera, Arden Sernow, Stuntaneous, Chris Wright, Ricardo Gainda, Hercules Johnson, Daniel Pining, Free Morphine, Cy, Clay Harrington, Anthony Bardill, Nate Williamson, Fergus Foley, Tom Painter, Kyle Hooten, Cameron Booth, Joaquin Coleman, William Davis, Stephen Garrett Day, Oscar Stangenberg, Egon Elbra, Jeanette Yazan Barguli, Sean Lees, Dios, Sergei Miloshishek, John Paul Harsh, Ray Sawyer, Max Spencer, Callips, Devin Vernon, Balder Carlson, Carl Clark, Max Wellington, Jonathan Holder, Rich Stower, Charles Favreau, Kim Winson, Scott Miller, Carol Henderson, Bradley J. Fisher, Matthias Hellstrom, Niles D. McDonald, Will Dobbins, Tom Rowerdink, Jonas Martinson, Will Wargrave, Jack Harvey, Jack Dawson, Michael Cronin, D. Stex, Jacob Robertson, Andrew Schiffel, Kevin Schaub, Nathaniel Tenzar, Alexander Dmitriev, Sharif Kazemi, Trivium Art History, Rob Taggett, Martin Markov, Tim Moon, Divya Faust, Colby Howard, John Walsh, Alex Zalato, Daniel Mower-Myring, Stephen Premiel, Matthew, Devin Fitzpatrick, Joe Hewison, Stephen Potyak, The German Snob, Simo Polakowski, Quitch, Jody Warren, Colin Sudana, Cameron Jackson, Michael Atwell, Brad Carr, Cameron Bradley Smith, Jeffrey Knutson, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albach, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Barton Carson, Brett Gilmo, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Ivan Marinov, Chris Larkey, Rob Clark, Aidan AK-47, Harley McAvoy, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Tizar Vicarian, Preston Allen, Kimmo Heikkinen, Ofer Elias, Sean, Alex Alcald, Erica Mikkonen, Dick Warbrul, Matthew Mason, Major Flyer, Q Rains, N.K. Jemson, David Carlson, Evan Hill, Ashley Rain, Ryan Pluckelman, Kiss Kaon, Chris Kaon, Pay, Brandon Boat, Josh Galak, Morton Scannick, Josh Farkas, Dewey, Niels Bachfrummer, Spyro Sedaris, Connor Biblo, Ryan Lewis, Nirag